To begin with, I just wanted to ask you if you went to the movies as a kid, and if you did, if there were any films or filmmakers or actors that were particularly favorites of yours.
Well, I've told this story many times, but I will tell it to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, in Toronto, every Saturday afternoon there would be like a lemming-like stream of kids going by themselves with no adults in those days to the local theaters. A couple of them we had. And I would see movies like Hopalong Cassidy, westerns, what we call sword fight movies, which were like pirate movies, and of course cartoons as well, and the usual sort of kiddie kind of fare, but I do remember one day coming out of my Hopalong Cassidy movie, and across the street was a cinema that only showed Italian movies because we had a huge Italian population in where I was growing up. And it was called The Studio. And I saw out of that theater coming a lot of people, all adults, and they were all weeping, they were all sobbing out on the street, crying, which was, in the 1950s and was pretty extraordinary. And I had to see what movie it was that had the power to do that to adults. And I crossed the street and I looked at the poster and it said La Strada by Federico Fellini. And that stuck with me, and of course I didn't see the movie for many years, and then I too was weeping, and I understood what kind of power movies had, the emotion that a movie could generate even in an adult. And so then came the 50s and the 60s, the era of the art movie, which was a capital A, and that was Bergman, that was Fellini, Kurosawa, Truffaut, Godard. And those were my formative guys, those were the filmmakers who let me know that movies could be art as well as entertainment.
And for you, do you remember the first time that you actually decided to pick up a camera and try to, even just for fun, to do something with it? And then also, was there a moment when you knew that this was what you had to do in the long run?
Well, I always thought I'd be a novelist. My father was a writer, and I really was sure that I would be a novelist. But at the same time, I was a kind of interested in technology, such as it was, and I do remember taking an 8mm camera and shooting a sports car race because I was a racing fanatic, and I actually raced myself in the 60s, cars and motorcycles. And I remember the first film I shot was at a place called Harewood Acres in southern Ontario. I was shooting footage of a car race, and actually a guy flipped his car and died.
Oh my God.
There were ambulances on the track. This was my first actual film that I shot. I haven't talked about this much,
oh
but
my God.
Definitely, yeah. And actually it was a CBC producer named Ted Pope who died in flipping his Triumph TR2, I think. So, not that I thought that was an augury of things to come, but
in a way,
that was my first footage. Yeah.
Oh my God!
And you're the first to hear it.
Wow.
So, but it was, and I shot stills with still cameras and so on. But really, it wasn't until the underground film movement and the New York Underground really was a huge influence on me because it was the '60s, and it was sort of, you don't have to go to Hollywood, and you don't have to go to film school. You just grab a camera, do your own thing. That was the '60s. That coupled with the fact that I saw a movie that a student had made. This was at the University of Toronto, so I wasn't too young, really. It was a film called Winter Kept Us Warm. It was the director was named David Sector, and it was incredibly shocking to me, and it's impossible to reproduce that moment of shock now for kids to know they can make movies when they're like 8 years old or 5 years old. But it had never occurred to me that I could make a movie. There was no movie industry in Canada. There was television, and very good television. There were documentary filmmaking from the National Film Board, but there was no real feature filmmaking. And suddenly I was watching a movie that had my colleagues, my friends in school as actors. They didn't even tell me they were doing a movie, and I was shocked. The realization was overwhelming. Wow, you can actually make a movie. And it was from that moment, the combination of that plus the underground film thing, was what induced me to start getting serious about playing with movies, I still didn't think that that was my métier or anything. I didn't even know you could have a career, actually, because after all this, it was still student filmmaking. And it was only gradually, really, that I thought that I'm still sort of surprised that I'm a filmmaker and not a novelist, actually. And I am writing a novel. It would be my first.
So, yeah, it'll still turn out. But what I've read was that, to a large extent, with the early productions, and even, I guess, beyond the first few, the Canadian, I don't know if it's the Board of Culture or whatever, something like that, was instrumental in financing some of your early work. And
right.
Can you explain how that works? Because I don't know if there's quite the same thing here in the U.S.
No, there isn't. There isn't. I mean, this is most countries have a possibility for the government to invest money, which is essentially taxpayers' money, in the production of film, either developing scripts and projects or actually investing in the production itself. Canada instituted, I think it was in the early 70s, that structure. It was called the Canadian Film Development Corporation, which has since become Telefilm Canada, and it is basically the federal government of Canada investing money in your movie. There are all kinds of rules and structures and everything else, but basically almost all of my movies have had some investment by the government of Canada.
Wow.
And most countries in the world have this. And a lot of the reason that they have this is kind of against Hollywood. It's not it's not hostile.
Right.
It's just that in order to withstand the popularity of Hollywood movies and the power of those studios and the ability to make big budget movies and so on, most countries have had to have some government support in order for there to be indigenous filmmaking. And Canada, being so close to the U.S. and sharing, I mean, there's Quebec filmmaking in French and French Canadian, which is not French but Québécois, a different language, can thrive because they have a kind of captive audience, but of course their budgets can't be too large because it's a very small audience. We, in English Canada, we share obviously the language with America, and that, in some ways it's an advantage, because universal international film language is now pretty much definitely English, and mostly because of the power of Hollywood. But at the same time, we can't really compete directly with Hollywood. We can't raise, we can't have a movie that costs $200 million. It's not possible.
And did it ever occur to you in those early stages of things to go out to Hollywood and try to operate within this easier to navigate system, or not I shouldn't say easier to navigate, but more traditional system?
Yeah. Well, there was a time early in my career where I thought I'd have to move to Hollywood, as my friends Ivan Reitman ultimately did, and Lorne Michaels was in Hollywood and then went to New York to do Saturday Night Live. These were my childhood friends, or my university friends. I thought I might have to do that because we were having great difficulty getting this first script that I had written, which was called Shivers in Canada, and They Came From Within in the States. It was a low-budget horror film, which in America, if you were working with Roger Corman, for example, was a no-brainer. I mean, of course you'd get it financed because it was an interesting subject, and if you did it cheaply enough, Roger would certainly finance it. In Canada, it was a big deal because people didn't make movies, and the one or two movies that got made would be kind of documentary-type movies about the difficulty of life on the prairies for the farmers or the fishermen in the Maritime.
Right.
And that was the National Film Board documentary influence. So it was, no one was making imaginative fiction in films, for sure, and definitely not horror films. So my first trip to LA was basically to sound that out, and I did go to Corman, and I did go to a lot of people, and they all said, yeah, we would make this movie. So I thought, okay, I'm going to have to move to LA. By the time I got back to Toronto, the Montreal company Cinepix that I had taken the script to originally said, Telefilm has basically caved in, and they've accepted that they should make commercial movies, and they think this is a commercial movie, even though it's a horror film, and they're a little weirded out being government about doing a horror film, but still, they've agreed to finance the movie. Well, it cost $185,000, the entire movie. But without their investment, we couldn't have made the movie.
And they probably made it back several times
They
over.
it made $5 million for the government, so the taxpayers got the
Right.
money back. So that was the beginning. I mean, literally, if it hadn't been for that government investment, I'm sure I would have been an American filmmaker, basically.
A question that occurs to me watching your movies or thinking about them collectively is, what is your principal objective when you make a movie? This answer may have changed over the years, but is it to provoke? Is it to disturb? Is it to entertain? What is it? What is it that you set out to do first and foremost?
I have no real agenda.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't have anything that I'm using film to promote,
Mm-hmm.
even artistically, other than really the basic artistic function is to explore what it means to be human.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what is the human condition? What is the nature of life? How do we live? How do we deal with each other? How do we exist? That's really it. I mean, I use film to explore those things, and there's so many ways you can do that. I'm always kind of bemused by the people talking about, well, Dangerous Method isn't very Cronenbergian, or it is, or it isn't.
Right.
I mean, I think anything I do is Cronenbergian,
Right.
enough for me
Right.
anyway. It satisfies me because I made the movie, and nobody else would do it exactly the same way. So I don't restrict myself in terms of subjects. I mean, anything that intrigues me. Cosmopolis came from out of the blue. I wasn't thinking about it. I knew the novels of Don DeLillo, some of them, but I didn't know Cosmopolis. And when it was proposed to me by Paulo Branco, who's a Portuguese producer, I read it and I thought, wow, I want to make this movie. 3 days before that, I didn't even know it existed.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so sometimes it's a lucky surprise, and sometimes with Dangerous Method, when I read Christopher Hampton's play, I could say to myself, well, I guess probably unconsciously, to use a Freudian phrase, expression, I've always wanted to do something about Freud, but I never had the structure and never had the sort of a concept to deal with such a vast topic. And here was a perfect dramatic structure. Very unexpected, because I didn't know anything about Sabina Spielrein and her relationship with Jung. So here was a beautiful, what I considered an intellectual ménage à trois, with a very strange and interesting love story, as well as dealing with the birth of psychoanalysis and life in Vienna at the turn of the century. All fantastic things, and things of interest to me always, but now suddenly a viable movie, whereas it hadn't been before.
You mentioned that people say Cronenberg, this is Cronenbergian, this isn't Cronenbergian. While I completely agree with you that whatever you do has got to be, it's only naturally Cronenbergian, the thing that I do notice is sort of, like everyone, there are certain themes or subject matter that seem to recur throughout your work. And so I just want to bounce a few quickly off of you to see if you know yourself what the root of those interests are. The first one, and I've read you had some funny remarks to say about this, and I understand. But like the idea of people call it venereal horror,
Yes.
And I wonder what that term itself, what you understand it to mean, and what you make of that label being applied to some of your films.
I have no idea what that means. I mean, it means sort of sex horror somehow, that involves genitalia, perhaps.
Right.
I mean, I have no idea. I mean, of course, I know what it means when they say it, but it's not. It really had to do with the specifics of those particular movies. You know, I mean, did Dead Ringers involve that? Did M. Butterfly involve that? Well, yes and no. I mean, in M. Butterfly, you have a man who's a woman who's really a man. You know, is that venereal horror? Well, I guess if you're the lover who was mistaken, it might be pretty fairly horrific, or not. So these categories really, it's only of passing interest to me. It's a game really for critics to play,
Right.
because creatively it's all a non-issue. It really means nothing. I mean, I do A Dangerous Method, I do Cosmopolis. Do I have a list? Do I say, well, I was going to do Cosmopolis, but there's no venereal horror in it, so either I put it in, or I'm not going to do the movie? No, it doesn't work that way at all. I think people, I take it as a compliment that they can put a label on this, body horror, venereal horror, whatever, because it means that there's a cinematic voice, of mind that's kind of surprising and maybe shocking and unique, and so they want to encode it somehow in a phrase.
And they're
so
paying
I don't take it as an insult,
right.
but it can come back to haunt you because people start to pigeonhole you suddenly in a way that you don't pigeonhole yourself.
And yet you have talked about the fact that you do, I guess maybe more than the average person, have a fascination with the body. I've read things that you said where you talk about very eloquently about why that might, what it is about the body that fascinates you. And I do note that you had said you were, I guess, a science major before transitioning to literature. So I'm just curious, is there anything more about that can be read into, why you feel that interest?
I can't. First of all, as a filmmaker, what do you film the most? You film the human body. You film the face, you film the body. I mean, that is your subject. Because unless you're doing a documentary on seals or something, you're filming the human body.
Right.
So, and you're filming it aesthetically and physically, and you're lighting it, and you're seeing the structure of it. So, any filmmaker, I think, has to some extent, really come to terms with the human body. And then, basically, it's really my understanding of life. I mean, I think of myself as an existentialist, basically. I'm an atheist. I think that mind is body, not separate from body. And so, how can you not be interested in the body? I mean, that's what we are, basically. So, philosophically, there's that. And then, for example, if someone asked me why would I be interested in Freud, well, there are many reasons. What an interesting man, what an interesting era. But his insistence on the reality of the human body was what made him considered to be quite a dangerous person, because he lived in an era that was very repressive, very Victorian, where people wore white stiff collars and women wore corsets, and the body was very constrained and covered up and not talked about. And he insisted on the reality of all these body things, that penises and vaginas and excrement and anuses and things that people didn't want to talk about, although they all had them. And they were, he was saying, this is us. And if we want to understand who we are and why our psychology works the way it does, and why sometimes we are neurotic and we are disabled socially by these neuroses, we must accept ourselves as a human body. Carl Jung, I think, eventually fled from that. He was fleeing the body into spirituality. He was saying, no, let's talk about spiritual, self-realization, and that's why he was popular in the 1960s in America, because that fit in very well with the sort of hippie culture, the idea of spirituality and so on. But I really feel that Freud had a better handle on the reality of what it is to be human, and the center of that was the body. So that's it's really not much more than that. It's not like I'm obsessed with the body, but everybody's obsessed with their bodies. Really,
sure.
It's just, how can you not be?
Well, I hope I can close with just two brief things. The first is, this is one of, I guess, probably the majority of your films you wrote yourself. Is that correct? I guess when you're looking at the numbers?
No, I don't think it's correct. Certainly the first bunch of movies I wrote myself, they were original as well, not adaptations. And I did think, although that really wasn't what the auteur theory, the author theory was about, that was more about filmmakers like Howard Hawks and John Ford, who didn't write their own scripts but were considered artists by the French critics. But later the idea became that you were the author of your film, and that therefore I thought you weren't really a serious filmmaker unless you wrote your own stuff. But really, writing and directing are very different, and you could be a terrific director and a terrible writer, and vice versa. It's very rare that someone's good at both of those things. And of course, as an arrogant young filmmaker, or at least wanting to be arrogant, I wrote my own stuff, but I also wrote my own stuff because I couldn't get other things made. I mean, no one would offer me a script because I hadn't directed anything. My first script, they really didn't want me to direct it at Cinepix because I had no experience, but I said, if you want this script, you've got to take me as a director. And they were so desperate to find a good script that they took me as a director. So, but as you can see with directors like Francis Coppola and Brian De Palma, for example, who wrote their own original material and don't write a lot now, or didn't later, it's because the momentum of your career takes you away from that, because you could it's hard once you've got a career as a director to say, I'm going to take 2 years off, write a script, which I might not like myself at the end, or I might like but can't get it made.
Right.
Whereas here's somebody saying, we can go into pre-production tomorrow
Right.
with the script that you really like that somebody else wrote. Or if you adapt The Dead Zone, this bestseller by Stephen King, we could be directing it next week.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's hard to resist that.
Mm-hmm.
And when I did The Dead Zone, which was the first movie I did that was an adaptation, and I didn't write the script,
Mm-hmm.
I really enjoyed it, and I really thought, wow, this is a good movie we've made. And by mixing my blood with somebody else, in this case Stephen King,
Mm-hmm.
later with J.G. Ballard and now with DeLillo, for example, and Christopher Hampton, you create something that you wouldn't have done on your own,
Mm-hmm.
but it's pretty exciting, and film is very collaborative. So why stop the collaboration at the writing? You know, I mean, you're collaborating with production designers, with actors. Why not? And with cameramen. Why not with writers? And after The Dead Zone, I stopped worrying about it. So a film. I mean, I wrote the script for Cosmopolis. That's my most recent script. It's not an original, obviously. It's an adaptation. I did the script for Crash, but I didn't do the script for History of Violence. I didn't do the script for Eastern Promises. It's just, to me, it's good fun, and it's all legitimate creatively.
Well, the subject of collaborators is the last thing I want to ask you about, because I noticed looking over things, I see that in addition to your sister, you've also worked almost all the time with the same production designer, cinematographer, and composer.
Yes, and editor.
And editor. You've now worked 3 times also with Viggo, and I don't know how many times with Vincent Cassel. So it seems like the stock company feel of a Howard Hawks, or somebody that there are a few people used to do that more often. At the same time, you are also now working with somebody like Keira Knightley, who heretofore I guess would be considered, you know, as Hollywood a actress. She's done great independent work as well, but a Hollywood star.
Yes.
So my question is, would you be interested in continuing to work in the same way with the same group of people, but on a sort of material that would fall more within the idea of a Hollywood production, which you've tended to avoid up to this point?
No, but I haven't really tried to avoid it. I've often joked and said I've been trying to sell out for years and nobody's been buying, you know. I mean, I did try to do the Matarazzi Circle with Tom Cruise and Denzel Washington at MGM, and MGM kind of went belly up for a while. That wasn't my fault. It wasn't their fault. There were other moments. I was going to do Total Recall that was with De Laurentiis, but I have done it at arm's length, you know. But I think the only in-house studio movie I ever really did was History of Violence with New Line, and you know, obviously New Line was not Warner Brothers, so I've tried, and in each case it's sort of not happened for all kinds of different reasons.
But it's not an opposition to him.
Absolutely not an opposition. I mean, it is a different kind of filmmaking, and it's just a question of accepting the game that you're playing. I would, you know, with independent filmmaking, you know that the financing will be a nightmare, but you will have total creative freedom. If you work with a studio, it's kind of the reverse. You know, you won't have total creative freedom, but if you know that going in and you accept that, shouldn't be a problem, really. It's you still trying to make a good movie, but within a different context. And I'd be interested to try it, and I've tried it many times. We'll see. Maybe it'll still happen.
All right, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.